since the protest started. As you were seeing there on your screen, it's day 60 now of the crisis that started in mid-February. Let's take a look at the timeline that we prepared for you of the events that took place in Bahrain since the protests began there. Everything started on February 14th, mid-February. The uprising broke out following, of course, the developments, similar developments in Egypt and Tunisia. Thousands took to the streets to protest discrimination and demand constitutional reform. But the peaceful protest turned deadly after police got involved and opened fire on the demonstrators. Of course, in those early days, the main demands that were being raised were political reform. A day after that, opposition MPs withdrew from Parliament in protest at the deadly crackdown that was used against the demonstrators there. Members of the main opposition group resigning. Just 3 days later, police launched another round of deadly attacks on peaceful protesters at Pearl Square, the iconic square that was used by anti-government protesters. They were gathered there, they camped out there, of course, similar to the situation we were seeing in Egypt. And on March 14th, that's approximately 26 days later, Saudi troops entered Bahrain to suppress protests. The opposition said that Saudi troops are occupying their country. The US said the Saudi military presence in Bahrain is not an invasion. The Bahraini king, meanwhile, declared martial law. Throughout that period that we're speaking about, those 26 days, there was no acts of violence between those days, but with the arrival of Saudi troops, violence again was resumed. On March 16th, you're seeing here Saudi and Bahraini troops staged a deadly crackdown on the protesters. Military forces stormed the Salmania hospital in the capital, Manama. We were hearing reports of doctors and medical staff there being attacked and abducted. A lot of concerns raised. A day after that, opposition leaders, a huge number of them, were arrested. The UN human rights chief slammed the Bahraini security measures as illegal. She was referring to the situation in hospitals, people being arrested while they were injured. Doctors and medical staff, as I said, were being attacked and were being abducted. So a lot of international concern was raised then. Then we saw on March 18th, a day after that, government forces destroying Pearl Square, the focal point of the anti-government protests. As 3 days after that, Human Rights Watch made an announcement saying that the government is unabashedly terrorizing anyone who is supporting the protesters. International concerns raising there throughout these protests. Just under 2 weeks after that, footage emerged showing Saudi troops destroying mosques and sacred sites in Bahrain as they stepped up the deadly crackdown, assisting the Bahraini government forces in trying to quell the protests throughout the country, not just in the capital, Manama, but also in various villages and elsewhere. We saw on April 6, 2 days after that, protests continuing despite the violent crackdown, and thousands mourned an anti-government protester who was killed by Saudi-backed forces. We were seeing the first funerals being held then on April 6 for those who'd been killed. A day after that, a female protester died of suffocation, also as a result of the violent crackdown by security forces as the death toll was rising. A day after that, April the 8th, a reporter was saying that Bahraini regime has suspended over 200 sportsmen for supporting the cause of the revolution. Saudi-led forces were intensifying their crackdown on opposition figures. On April 9th, a day after that, police opened fire on protesters in the southern town of Sitra. Very violent reports coming in from there. People still mourning the deaths of those who were attacked there. The Saudi-led forces, you can see they're intensifying their crackdown on opposition figures and police opening fire. Let's go to April 11th, 2 days after that, Saudi-backed forces arresting senior Bahraini clerics. And as I said, and as Mr. Nabil Rajab was telling us, a lot of people arrested since then, clerics, teachers and human rights activists. A day after that, more protesters tortured to death in police custody. People were referring to signs on the bodies of those who'd been killed, signs of torture, they said, while they were being held by security forces. On April 13th, anti-regime protests were raging on as people are still mourning another victim of police brutality. Human Rights Watch calls for an investigation into the recent killings of protesters. A brief look at the timeline of events taking place there in Bahrain as a result of the protest that started in mid-February. Violence still continuing, crisis still continuing there. Well, also joining us for this discussion is